Hello and welcome to tonight's live stream conversation on sacred wounds, a path to healing from spiritual trauma. My name is Steve Knight. I am the Director of Marketing and Sales for Chalice Press, and really excited, honored to be here tonight with my friend, author, speaker, contemplative activist,
Hello,
Teresa Pasquale.
welcome to tonight's live stream conference.
And special guest joining us, Isaac Archuleta from Denver, Colorado. Isaac, let me throw it over to you real quick and have you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you do, and then we'll go to Teresa.
Absolutely. So I'm based out of Denver, Colorado, and I'm a licensed professional counselor. I work specifically with the evangelical community and the LGBTQ community. So I spend a lot of time at the intersection where the LGBTQ community has been influenced by the evangelical church and vice versa. And so I kind of hang out right in the area where Teresa has written about kind of healing from faith wounds. So I work with families all over the nation. My office is based here, but I do a lot of Skype therapy, and I just do my thing.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
And Teresa, tell us where are you coming from tonight?
I'm so glad you asked that, Steve. I'm coming to you from Cleveland, Ohio. More specifically, the Cleveland Hostel, which is a lovely place. But the only quiet area is in the basement in the laundry room. So I am currently coming to you via, very metaphorically appropriate, the basement, the basement of the house.
Yeah.
So if you see any strange background things or piping, that is because I am in the basement. And that is where we begin our healing, so it is an excellent place to be.
Ah, great segue. We've known each other for some time now, Teresa, but I'm excited to hear and learn more about kind of your journey and your story. That has led you, to this point. Tell us, and the folks out there watching, tell us who you are and kind of what your journey has been to lead you into the work that you are doing now.
So I am, education-wise, I'm trained as a licensed clinical social worker. I went to NYU for that degree program and focused on trauma. But what led me into NYU was my own experience of trauma. So I had sexual trauma at 18 and 19, and that led to what I would later discover was post-traumatic stress disorder. And in that process, spun down that hole that people go down into inside our body, our mind, and our spirit. And I had left any kind of faith context before any of that happened. So I was sort of floating in an amorphous space, both in my spiritual life, but also just in my general life. And in my process of seeking my own healing, I found, which I speak about a lot in my first book, Mending Broken, about the process of healing that moved its way for me through finding space in my body through yoga, and then eventually becoming a yoga teacher, studying Buddhist meditation, and learning to be mindful of the thoughts that were pervasive for me, of fear and of panic that came out of trauma, and then eventually into the conduit of learning how to do contemplative practice and engage with the Christian contemplative tradition and the mystics therein. So in many ways, my healing from my own trauma was a spiritual journey. I don't know that I would call it a religious journey, but it was definitely a spiritual journey. And when I went into grad school, I knew I wanted to help people find a way to heal that wasn't this problem, but was really going into the places that hurt and finding ways to transform that. And that happened by way of working with refugees, people seeking asylum from torture in third world countries, happened by working with combat veterans and then survivors of sexual trauma, and then into working with communities with trauma and addiction. But simultaneous to that process of my professional life growing, I found myself entering more spaces of sort of progressive and anomalous spiritual communities. Much of that beginning by going to places like the Wild Goose Festival, where so many people that were sort of seeking a progressive version of faith outside of some of their constrictive, conservative, fundamentalist, sometimes even cult-like backgrounds were coming, almost seeking spiritual asylum, you know, in a way. And I found that as I began to talk to those people, coming into those spaces, talking about contemplative practice, but also about trauma and healing, that I was hearing story after story of people that had been hurt in these faith contexts in the same way that I would define any other kind of trauma. And their symptoms, for many of them, were indicative that they actually were experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. The hard part was that they were sort of, again, as spiritual asylum folks, were fleeing traditions that told them that they were bad in some way. You know, so this was this negative reinforcement that they were leaving. Nobody was validating their trauma because their primary reference point were the old traditions. And the old traditions were saying, you're bad because you're a woman, you're bad because of your sexuality, you're bad because of your identity. Whatever that is that doesn't fit in the mold of what we're saying is what God loves. And so ultimately, we're saying is lovable. And so all of these people were suffering from trauma, and many of them PTSD, and no one had ever even opened that door to say what it really was. So they were just kind of floating around in this pain. And I always say I never intended on writing the book Sacred Wounds. After I wrote my first book on trauma, Mending Broken, I thought, well, I'm not going to write a whole nother book on trauma. But then these stories kept coming forward, and these people that didn't really know what they were going through or even how to begin to mend that hurt. And it just felt like a necessary thing to do, to give voice to that pain and explain what it looked like, and maybe it looked like that, why it looked like trauma, why it's so painful when it's not just, you know, one place that's hurting you, but it's potentially your family system, your community system, your friend system, and then above all of that, the God system, the ultimate parent that says, again, you're not good enough, or you're not good, or you're not okay the way that you are. That it was necessary to show people that this was valid hurt, and then begin to work together to see the way to healing that trauma as unique to its own kind of hurt.
Wow. I want to talk more about how you started talking a little bit there about kind of how this book came together. But before we kind of go back to that, I'm curious, Isaac, as listening to Teresa share a little bit about her story and her journey, are there parts of that resonated for you, or what has your kind of personal journey been like in terms of reconciling, kind of pain and hurt with church and faith?
Absolutely. I grew up in a very conservative denomination, a denomination where I was taught if I behaved well enough, God would do almost anything that I asked for. And as a bisexual son at that time, I didn't know what I would call myself in the future. But as a son who was attracted to both genders, the messages of theology that were delivered in my church, and as Teresa was saying, from the God system, my family system, my religious system, all of those were influencing this message that because of who I loved, I was damaged and I was dirty. And for a 9-year-old hearing this message, the delivery into me, the message that I internalized was, someday I will be doomed to a life in hell because of who I love, because of the way I love. And that left some major wounds. By the time I had gotten my first car, I was 17. I was driving through the mountains in Colorado, and I aimed my Jeep at a tree, just full of despair because of the messaging that my sexuality or even my identity was disgusting or sinful. And by the time I was in seminary getting my master's degree, I was praying a very sincere prayer that if I was going to commit a sin that would literally send my soul to hell, I was asking God to send a bus through an intersection and kill me before I got home. The recovery from that, just like Teresa said, wasn't necessarily a psychological journey. It wasn't a religious journey. It was more of a spiritual journey, tapping into something deeper than the doctrine we teach and really connecting with the Spirit. And that was absolutely imperative for me on my journey.
Wow, thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
As the father of a 9-year-old, that struck me when you at that age, that young, that you were both in touch with who you were and those messages. Wow,
Mm-hmm.
that's really, and the work that you're doing now. As you mentioned, you work with a lot of folks who are doing the same work for themselves in terms of reconciling their sexuality and their faith.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Really important work.
Thank you.
So, Teresa, just share a little bit more. You said briefly a little bit there about the folks that you began encountering, sort of like, would you say maybe over the last few years, last several years, that you had been coming in contact with, who had story after story, and kind of how did that come about, and then how did you go about, I guess, drawing on those as inspiration and as weaving them together into this book, Sacred Wounds?
Well, I would say what you were describing, Isaac, is so familiar to many of the stories I heard. That it's this feeling that, and the theology builds, right, and the belief system builds on that there's something not just bad about me, but what is bad about me, according to the system, means that I'm going to hell, which is the most extreme version of punishment we can imagine just for being who you are. And so as I heard these stories, I would hear the dramatic impacts that it had on people's lives. So what you were talking about, Isaac, that suicidality, the feeling of just, how do I make it go away? I don't know how to change who I am, but maybe I can just not exist anymore. And I heard that across the board, whether it was LGBTQ folks who, that's such an embedded wound in that way, because it really is everything about who I am. Same thing for women, in certain contexts, many times persons that were physically, sexually, or emotionally abused, but everyone was spiritually abused by that ideology that something was wrong. And so that's an insufferable existential problem. If inherently I believe that I am bad, because everything I know and I've learned said I am bad, then what is the only way to fix that is to not exist. And so that's why so many people end up suicidal, end up, having massive, self-medication through various kinds of addiction processes, and just even self-harm or self-injury, cutting, burning, those kind of things, that there are these, it just becomes insufferable just to exist. And so as I was hearing these stories in these variety of places, because I would be going in talking about some manner of trauma experience and some manner of contemplative spirituality. And so both of those things would bring those people into the conversation or into a workshop I was leading, because they felt this wound, even if they didn't know how to describe it. And very much, even as Isaac was saying, it being a spiritual journey, the process of healing. There's this deep inborn feeling for everyone to have purpose and meaning. And so the spirituality is a draw for people, and when it isn't necessarily put inside a theological context, it seems a little safer. So it would be, when I'm talking about spirituality or contemplative practice, those folks would show up that were hurt. When I was talking about trauma in general, those folks would come and show up. And it really was the impact of that hurt the extent of people really being suicidal, being self-harming, being utilizing addictive processes just to function in life, just to be. That was the impetus, that it needed to be more than just a small conversation that I had in these moments, but rather there needed to be resource material for people to actually have as a guidepost. And so all of a sudden, all of my learning and my personal experience through my own trauma was meeting this need, you know, that I was seeing right in front of me. And I felt like, well, if I can bring those things together, I can offer something that's a physical resource that people can take with them and look at and say, oh my God, that's me, and I'm not alone.
I'm really curious, Teresa, and feel free to jump in, Isaac, if you have questions for Teresa along the way here. But the contemplative spirituality piece, I'm just curious what your journey was with that, and if you could share about obviously we're beyond thrilled to have had the foreword written by Richard Rohr, founder of the Center for Action and Contemplation. And tell folks about your connection with Father Rohr and kind of what your journey has been with contemplative spirituality.
So I found the writings of Father Richard Rohr when my healing process was meeting the space of contemplative Christian mysticism, and having gone through the yoga tradition and the Buddhist tradition and finding the contemplative center that we kind of know exists in the Eastern tradition. When I finally discovered that there was this whole lineage in the Christian tradition that we had lost along the way, I discovered teachers like Thomas Keating, Richard Rohr, and a variety of other teachers throughout history, Teresa of Avila, Julian of Norwich, all the historical teachers. And it resonated with me because, again, as Isaac said as well, it's a spiritual journey in healing just as much as it is your mind and your body and your emotions. And so I really resonated with those teachings, the ancient truth, the trueness of it, that was just as true and also just as relevant, or almost there was conversational with the Eastern traditions when you get into the Christian mystic traditions, and isn't laden down by theological dogma. So it's entirely about personal experience with God, which I've learned a lot, by being engaging with people that come out of evangelical traditions, that there isn't a teaching in those contexts of a personal, relational experience with God that is intimate, like a friendship, like a lover, like a partner. And I think that's part of some of the greatest damage, beyond just the hurting of a person and saying that they're not good enough. The other piece of it is they have not offering anybody any tools to access God, but through the community, but through the brain and the theology of understanding God. And so I see so many people struggle to find that bridge to the personal connection to God, because to me the contemplative is the healing, the spirituality of all traditions offers us the conduit to a personal relationship with God, which offers us a healing relationship, that unhealthy, hurtful relationship that bad and harmful theology teaches people. But so many of the people that are coming from hurtful contexts are the same people who were never taught to access the healing God. So I'm interested, actually, Isaac, what your perception is about that on your own journey, because you talked very much about it being a spiritual journey of healing.
Sure. One thing that you're talking about, at least in my perspective, is when we approach religion through this cognitive brain knowing, we also kind of pair with it, I think, the body. And it's if you can behave well enough, then you're somehow going to reach a higher level of righteousness. And I think that becomes a trap, specifically when we're trying to heal some of this traumatic wounding. And that was definitely the case for me. When I was a senior in high school, I was fasting 2 meals a day. because I wanted this. I read Isaiah 58 over and over and over again, and it taught me that if I could control my body well enough, that the Spirit would reward me somehow. And through my spiritual journey of healing, it became a connectedness, understanding the emotions of a God who loves me, as opposed to perfecting my behavior to make a God love me. You know, in one of the pillars of codependence is this idea of the illusion of control. I am in charge of God's emotions. I keep God happy. I keep God not mad at me. That is an illusion, and we call it the illusion of control, that I'm controlling God. And that's not a contemplative practice, one, but it also diverts us from understanding the Spirit. And so it was very, very important for me to do away with that illusion of control and begin engaging in the Judeo-Christian language, engaging the Abba Father, this Spirit who had incredible emotion for me. And when I think of, as a clinician, what repairs trauma, lots of things, but one of them is that secure attachment. And I can't securely attach to a spirit if I'm not safe. And I'm not safe if I'm in charge of keeping them happy. I'm only safe when they can refer to me with unconditional love and unconditional positive regard. And so I think that was one major piece to engaging a spiritual journey versus that cognitive body religious journey.
Well, and I love what you're saying about the relationship, paralleling the clinical, what we understand in therapy as unhealthy relationship versus healthy relationship, and unhealthy attachment versus healthy attachment. I always say, or I've been saying a lot, if we took the relationship that people have with God inside of those unhealthy contexts, those unhealthy relational frameworks that dysfunctional theology offers, if you took the word God out and you put in any other relationship, you could go into any therapist office or talk to any friend, and they would be like, that is a really sick relationship, and you need to get out of that immediately. But we don't look at religion in that same way. We don't analyze relationship to God in that same way. And I talk some in Sacred Wounds about that secure versus insecure attachment, and the idea really of it being almost equivalent to a family systems problem, or a family systems dysfunction, because God becomes the macro parent of the family system. And then your personal family system and your faith community and everyone in it become an extension of that original relationship. And so if that original relation of God that's unhealthy and that's codependent and that is insecure because it requires me to be the perfect child in this exact way for me to get love, then there's no way to have a healthy relationship inside that. And for so many people, that reflects itself outward to their interpersonal relationships in the rest of their life. And the hard part, I think, for people also, even as they leave the unhealthy faith systems, so they understand now, like the theology is not healthy for me, the community is not healthy for me. But that's another thing that we haven't necessarily talked on a wide scale about enough, that it's not just about leaving that system, but just like if you leave a domestic violence situation or if you leave a family of abuse, that without healing, we end up just replicating those relationship patterns in every other relationship we have. So then you have people that are hurt, leaving these traditions, but stuck with the baggage of unhealthy relationship patterns that have not yet been healed.
Wow. I think a lot of folks coming to this conversation are I think this is so much what folks are looking for, is just sort of the things that you both have been sharing here have been so helpful in terms of just being able to understand and view your experience through a different lens or through a healthier lens. And I'm curious, what in your experience with folks that you have talked to and folks that you have counseled with, what the ways that, because there's kind of a spectrum of severity, right? In some of the conversations I know that I've been a part of, where I've used the term church hurt, there's been a number of people who have reacted and said it's worse. It's not, that's so mild. My experience is so much worse than that. So there's the spectrum of experience of people who have just sort of had some bad experience with church, bad experience with Christianity or religion or whatever, to some extremes of abuse, right? So for folks wherever they're coming from or wherever they're at, what just what are some of those other tools or resources that you offer to folks as they're trying to find their way forward in working through the hurt and pain that they're still holding on to?
Well, at least for me, I think it holds true with any trauma, and it's just as true with religious and spiritual trauma is wherever you are right now is okay. A lot of people, particularly if you come from experience of being shamed for who you are, or even for leaving the tradition that hurt you, so therefore leaving that unhealthy system that hurt you. There's so much shame that people carry for where they are or where they think they should be or how they are versus how they think they should be. So for me, the primary or the initial piece is an acknowledgement of the hurt, and then just a validation of where people are in that moment. The ultimate tenet of therapy is meet people where they are. So everybody, like you said, so well, Steve, they're on a spectrum of hurt, and they're also on a spectrum of where they are in their own journey. So some people may be seeking a new tradition, to enter into. Some people may be seeking a spirituality that's outside of a traditional context, or at least their own context. So maybe seeking in an Eastern tradition or in, an earth-based practice system. And some people may be in a space where they don't want to even consider anything that looks like religion or religious construct at that place and time. So I think it's important to acknowledge that wherever people are is okay, that the hurt is real, and acknowledging the hurt, I think, is powerful. It's powerful in all trauma, but I think because we're just at the precipice of talking about spiritual trauma as authentic, but it's especially important because for people, much like, say, the Vietnam veteran in 1979, when we first said that that PTSD was a real thing, and people were just like, oh my God, thank God, I'm not crazy, this is a thing. I think we're in a place like that right now with spiritual trauma, where people are just, they're so hungry to find some answers, and so just the validation that the trauma is real. And then I think there's such a value also in being, having space in community, not space that manifests other unhealthy iterations of community, so hurt people, but rather creating space where people feel protected enough to share, but to also feel like there's hope, because again, we're talking about this for many people for the first time. The idea that there's a way to heal from this, and that we have a whole tradition in trauma, the history of understanding trauma and trauma healing that can be utilized, for this purpose is new to people. So I think also that hope is accessible, and that these relational patterns can be repaired are really important. What would you say, Isaac, in terms of how you approach it with people?
Oftentimes when people come into my office, what they tell me is they're describing trauma, but they're blaming themselves for it. So something like, God's not speaking to me, or bad things keep happening in my life, my interactions. And I think one of the beginning places that I find in my practice most often is identifying that what they're dealing with is shame, and helping them identify that what they're describing is trauma. I think that awareness it's really, well, it's imperative that we describe, you've been traumatized. This isn't the result of you being some dirty, damaged person. This is the result of trauma. And so I think that creating an awareness for clients and parishioners is really massive. And I find this really important to mention today, because I think, and I don't, maybe you agree, Teresa, maybe you don't, but I think that the effects of trauma are almost normalized in, at least in evangelical Christianity. You know, this idea that God will spit you out of his mouth if you're lukewarm. So, you know, zip into shape. That's something that we talk about very, very normally with one another. And that can produce some very, very traumatic shame. And that is the message of who I am is intrinsically damaged. And oftentimes the clients who come into my room are bawling because they just can't get it right, you know, quote unquote. And that's when we really kind of have to hit the pause button, like Teresa was saying, and say wherever you're at is just fine. You know, we would never blame the 1-year-old for taking one step and then falling over. We would never blame that 1-year-old. We would say, this is exactly where you're supposed to be. You're supposed to take a step and then fall and then get back up. Same thing in the spiritual journey. The spirit is okay and intentionally created every developmental step on purpose. And we're supposed to be there. It's not a, how can I move along faster or more quickly? So I kind of agree with what you're saying.
Teresa, did you say you grew up evangelical as well? Or not?
I did not, no. So
okay.
I grew up in Catholic tradition. So it's very, so my context is very different, which is why for me it's so important, and it's been so powerful to sit in so many spaces where folks that come out of evangelical tradition exist, because like Isaac is saying, it's dynamically different how people are taught in their relationship. There's this intrinsic shame, right? So even whether people stay in that context or they don't, or they acknowledge it as unhealthy or they don't, there's this inherent shame of not good enough that gets built into the relationship with God and to the theology about why the relationship with God is that way, you know? So it's always been interesting to me to see how you have the same stories, right, the same Bible, and yet the context is so different. So particularly in very conservative, fundamental, evangelical traditions, the focus is really on the shame. The focus is really in the not good enough. And so the entire principle that builds your understanding of yourself in the world is built in this very insular community that tells you that you're not good enough, and that God is sort of deigning to love you anyway. And, you know, as Isaac has said, you know, kind of talked about, it's that you have to do things exactly this way so that God will still deign to love you in your brokenness and your badness and you're not good enough. So whether or not, I mean, you have things that are outliers that are just stated as wrong in the community based on gender, sexuality, and other things, the baseline for everyone is this sort of not good enough. So we think about it in terms of relationship. If your primary relationships are built on the fact that you're not good enough to love, but we're going to love you anyway, but God's going to love you anyway, and that you have to continue to try to achieve betterness by right action, betterness by pushing yourself beyond often what you should, just to attain that love that's given to you even though you don't deserve it. It sets up a whole dynamic of how people see themselves as just not good, regardless of whether or not they stay or leave. And so I saw you posted a question that somebody had from that that was watching on the YouTube, Steve, that talks about this person in particular is describing this deep personal relationship with God as a very sort of abusive, domestically violent relationship that, you know, I have to be good enough to love, and feeling rejected and condemned, or you burn in hell forever, right? So it's like, it's not just I'm going to hurt you, it's not just I'm even going to kill you, but it's like if you don't get good enough, even in all your badness, if you don't get good enough for me to love, then you're going to burn in hell forever. That is the punishment. And imagine the fact that we're teaching that, like you said, Isaac, even to the 1-year-old child. You know, this idea that, you know, right action, and you're even inside of your own imperfection is the only thing that's going to save you from hell and burning in the fires of damnation forever. That is a really hard thing to shake in your life. And removing yourself from that thing as being their primary understanding of themselves, even when they know it wasn't a healthy place to be.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I want to share that this personal story was shared anonymously with us through the Chalice Press Facebook page, and I shared it with Isaac and Teresa. Folks who are watching, if you want to, you know, share a comment, your story, a question for Isaac or Teresa, you can do that in the comments on YouTube. You can send it anonymously as a message through the Chalice Press Facebook page. Would love to be able to bring you and your stories and your questions into this conversation. Teresa, I appreciate you bringing that in. And for folks out there who are watching, hopefully, are hearing some encouraging things here from Isaac and Teresa that will give you tools to help you exactly wherever you are with this tonight. I grew up evangelical as well, so I'm curious to go here for a little bit and hear for both of you, because, you know, this person's story, you know, that they shared, they grew up evangelical / charismatic. Having grown up evangelical and you know, having heard a lot of these stories, what is happening in the evangelical world right now? There's a lot of good things that are happening in the evangelical world, and I see positive changes. Would you agree with that? I'm curious to hear what your experiences have been, Isaac and Teresa, and what might be happening out there within evangelicalism that are signs of hope. And
Sure. Want me to start? I think that you know, I loved when I picked up Teresa's book for the first time and saw that Father Richard Rohr had wrote the foreword. I was both impressed but really excited. His writings have been so influential for me and my church. I go to the first open and affirming church that's LGBTQ, open and affirming evangelical church in the nation, started by Mark Tidd. Phenomenal church. But in this evangelical church and other churches like Eastlake, they use some songs and some verbiage. I think what's happening is the evangelical church as a system, if you will, it's on its own spiritual journey as a collective. And that has been really, really fun to watch. That if the evangelical church is a body, we're counting through the birthday years and our maturity level is keeping up with us. We're moving slow, but we're moving. And so it has been really fun to see more of a contemplative dynamic infused in evangelicalism. And that has been, it came to Highlands at the perfect time in my own spiritual journey, because that was the missing piece. You know, I was at a very conservative Christian seminary, and I honestly would say that that spiritual contemplative piece is exactly what I needed to begin my own faith healing journey. And so that's really exciting. And I hear lots of profound, you know, prolific speakers. Vicky Beeching always talks about going to the library and picking up the mystics, and we're seeing it a lot. So I'm really excited about that.
I I like Isaac that continuum of growth, you know, that you're talking about in the evangelical tradition. And of course, like every growth process, not every faith community is going to be moving in that sort of evolutionary process of faith. But I do see sparks. You know, I see people, many of them either exiting places that were unhealthy for them, but coming out of that evangelical culture and wanting to retain the goodness of it. You know, there's a real healthy tribalism in many ways in there. You know, there's a lot of language that that people really understand, and they don't want to leave necessarily the whole culture of their origin behind to be able to feel included in the body of God or what that looks like for them. So I see more inclusivity, you know, more communities that are trying to be inclusive of voices of women, voices of LGBTQ folks, and intentionally trying to move towards an inclusive love of God. And it's, like I said, it's never going to be everybody, but it is those steps, almost spiritually, spiritual childhood, you know, in many ways, because again, the tradition has often been alienated from the spiritual tradition of the mystics and of the contemplative. And so it's been cool for me to be evangelicals that would consider themselves more progressive, and hearing them talk about Richard Rohr, you know, or some of the ancient contemplatives and the tradition, that much of it was lost, you know, in what we've seen of evangelical church in the, you know, in the last century of its sort of evolution. And so to me, it's the both and that is this, that sort of contemplative spirituality that we're going to bring along the culture and the parts of the culture that we grew up in that we do love, and the community that we love, and different factors of that. But we're going to also bring in the history and the tradition of the things that maybe were lost and weren't offered to us, so that we can learn to have spiritual relationship with God that is individual, personal, that we can have spiritual practices that come out of our own contemplative tradition in Christianity and infuse that into what we're building, because it is part, to me, I believe, part of the healing process also comes from regenerating the contemplative and knowing how to be more accepting of ourselves and others. That's inclusive in the teachings of the Christian mystics and really the global mystics, but we have it in our own tradition. And so I think this sort of moving together of the both and of the ancient and also this contemporary evangelical tribe, finding ways to merge and become something, you know, the next iteration of whatever that is that it's going to look like. That there are some really exciting things percolating, and there's a lot of work that people are doing in themselves and in their communities to try to heal and repair those wounds and create safe spaces where more people can show up, and you don't have to shuffle off the things you loved about where you came from, but you can sort of the spiral dynamics theory, transcend and include. So include what I love, but transcend the hurtful parts.
I was curious if you were going to get to spiral dynamics there, Teresa. That's a fun segue. I don't know if we have time to go into all of that. Folks can Google spiral dynamics if they want to, or they can come to the Enfolding Spirituality Conference this month in Los Angeles. Tell us, you're on a little bit of a mini book tour right now since the book just came out. Would love to have you just tell folks what you're up to and where you're going to be, and I know you would love to connect with folks around the country as you're out there talking about sacred wounds and talking about this new book.
Yes, absolutely. So after I crawl out of my Cleveland hostel basement, I will be moving onward around the country. So I'll be in Cleveland for a couple of days, sort of a little bit of a divergence. I'll be speaking at a equine therapy conference talking about healing and relationship with animals. But following that, I'm going to be in Boston, and I'll be doing an event November 9th at a place called The Crossing, which is sort of a contemplative church iteration coming out of the Episcopal tradition that got started a number of years ago. And so they're going to be hosting a Sacred Wounds gathering there on November 9th, and I'll be posting about that upcoming. And then on the 12th to the 14th, I'll be in Redondo Beach, California, at the Hatchery LA, where they'll be doing that Unfolding Spirituality conference that you spoke about, Steve, with Rob Bell and a man named Don Beck, who is sort of one of the primary people who's really brought spiral dynamics into our contemporary context. And I'll be talking about sacred wounds as it relates to that theory, and this theory of sort of transcending and including our experiences of pain, but transcending the hurting place. And also doing something with the Homebrewed Christianity folks, with Trip Fuller, who also just got us a book that just came out. One of those nights doing a podcast dialogue with him at the conference. And then I'll be going to North Carolina, where I think I'll be doing a little something in Asheville, potentially the weekend of the 21st and 22nd of November. And then something in Carolina Beach, which we're just formulating right now, which again I'll have more details about, at a local church that wants to do something. And then there's a couple of other things that I'm going to be doing coming up later into 2016. Some of that will be alongside of some of the things we're doing with Faith Rooted Organizing through Transform Network. We're going to be doing some regional gatherings around the country, and so we're going to be tacking in some sacred wound stuff with that. And then also in February, I can say, because we firmed in Isaac's terrain in the Rocky Mountains, which I'm super excited about because I lived in Fort Collins for 3 years, so I totally missed the Rocky Mountains. And I'm going to be at ILIF for the 11th doing some kind of lecture and practice workshop, and then potentially some area around there, including Kathy Escobar's, spending time with them on February 17th. And I have some things percolating potentially in some other states like Arkansas and Georgia and possibly Tennessee. So there'll be more to come, but that's where I'm at for now.
Real quick, if folks who are watching are interested in bringing you to talk about this, what's the best way for them to do that, to reach you?
So the best way, Miss Holly Roach of Transform Network is sort of the organizer of all things scheduling. She's a master event woman. So connecting with her through Transform Network. Steve, what's the official email? Is it just holly@transformnetwork.org?
That's correct.
Okay, so that would be the best way to connect, to bring something to your local area if you would like.
That's right. Transformnetwork.org is the website, and there is a page there with information about speakers and trainers, and Teresa is one of them. We got this question from YouTube, so let me share it with you both. Can you recommend any resources that people can share with their therapists who might not have an understanding of the damage that can be caused by spiritual wounding? So folks who are going to therapists who are not particularly faith-based, tools and resources for folks to help the folks that they're seeking therapy from understand the uniqueness of spiritual wounding and spiritual trauma.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would just say I want to hear from Isaac because he's doing the work, really in the field right now to help people, and they're showing up at his door. But one of the things I do at the very end of Sacred Wounds is I list a guide to how to find a therapist that can help you, because this is a newer area for most providers. So even if they have an expertise in trauma, it's pretty unlikely that they're going to have an expertise in spiritual trauma. And so the way that I try to guide people is really to find somebody that you resonate with, and really to have a process of interview. It's okay to do that with the Buddhism survivors do, because there's such a yes, you know, I want to do the right thing. So sometimes it's hard to ask those questions to find somebody who's a good fit for you. But if you can find somebody who's a trauma therapist in your area, and for many of them it's going to be just the willingness to understand this new iteration of trauma that is going to probably be a new area of practice. So if they're ex in trauma, and they have a willingness to learn alongside their client what it is, what it looks like, you know, and maybe even to connect with other providers. Like Isaac could be a resource for somebody that's maybe a provider in another state that's looking to understand better, or hopefully there'll be more literature like Sacred Wounds, but to have a text, something like that, where you could actually read together. I've done that with clients for areas that were not my primary focus. You know, read a piece of a text together with your client so that you can move through the process and they can really walk you through it in a safe way. Isaac, what would be some of your suggestions?
You know, there is a faculty member at Denver Seminary. Her name is Heather David Duke Gingrich, and she wrote Restoring the Shattered Self, A Christian Counselor's Guide to Complex Trauma. That's a very good book. Dr. Heather Gingrich is a brilliant trauma therapist, so I definitely would recommend that. A shameless plug, I picked up the book, Sacred Wounds. Go get it. It's a great resource for your therapist. And a smart therapist, I think, would do some of their own research. Specifically in my area, one of my favorite authors, his last name is Lucy. I think he published an article in 1996 on anti-gay religious abuse, and he goes into depth about how is the church really abusive for the LGBTQ community. So those are 3 very trustworthy names for you. Yeah.
That's great. Wow. Such a rich conversation, and I know that there's so much more that we could talk about. Are there any kind of, as we are getting close to the 1 hour mark here, just kind of closing thoughts or comments that that you guys might have, things that you are thinking, if there's one thing I really want people out there who are dealing with their own sacred wounds, their own spiritual trauma, to hear, what would that be?
From me, I would just say validation. You know, I just want to reiterate the validation piece because I think it's so important. So spiritual trauma is real. It is a genuine experience of trauma. For some people, not everyone, but for some people, it will lead to the symptoms that would look like PTSD. And we know from the data says about 20% of people that experience trauma experience PTSD. Although we don't have data yet, I hope we will, about spiritual trauma in the future. I would say that could be significantly affect every system of your understanding and every relationship experience. So it's so pervasive for people. I think there's just a larger propensity for it to impact people, and kind of that trauma response can get stuck. And so there are many people that I've met that have experienced spiritual trauma that have PTSD. And I would say the other piece of that is that there's hope. You know, one of the reasons I wrote Sacred Wounds was not just to lay out a roadmap for what it looks like, but to lay out some foundations for healing and say it's possible, you know, and these are some doorways and these are some gateways. And maybe this is a way you can start looking at your hurt in a way that's going to help you moving forward. One of the things that I talk about a bunch in the book is this idea of being able to not be ruled by the story that you were given. You know, so the story in unhealthy religion that says you're not good enough, there's something about you that's wrong. That we don't have to live in the stories that have hurt us. We can understand that that's where we came from, but we have the autonomy to write the story of our future that looks different than the one that we were given. And so giving people permission to begin to imagine how they might live out this story of who they are outside of the context of hurt and outside of the things and the people and the systems that may have told them they're not good enough. Everyone is inherently good enough exactly as they are. And if nothing else, I hope that people understand that as a woman, as an LGBTQ person, as somebody who disagrees with the system you came from, you're not bad. You're not inherently someone that should feel shame, whether you're inherently good exactly as you are. And that is a perfection and a beauty in that. And that people can begin to have hope that they can live into that story that they're good and they're holy, they're divine, and that there is a God that exists out there, if you want to call it God, or the universe, or the cosmos, that loves and accepts each one of us exactly as we are, that we don't need to change or do right action or be different than we were born or made to be, but that we are inherently loved exactly as we are.
Thank you. Wow.
You know, one of the things when I often share my story in settings like this or in seminars, it's inevitable for Christian parents, evangelical straight parents of a gay child, they'll come up to me and they'll say, "My child is so far away from God. What was it, Isaac, that kept you connected? Why did you want to be a Christian after all of this?" And I think one of the most profound elements to my spiritual journey was not only the validation that Teresa's talking about, but shifting away from the people had defined God for me, and understanding if God could be the most loving parent with the most incredible resources of compassion and forgiveness, and beyond that, just love, what would this relationship look like? And on top of that question, I got to stack on top all of this clinical knowledge of what is a secure, healthy attachment between two people. And I had to not reinvent, but redefine who is God. And relying on what is my intuitive knowing of God more than the church's definition of who God is. And for me, that was incredibly necessary. So I guess to answer the question directly, what would I say? My encouragement would be to rely on the intuitive knowing of a being who loves you no matter how you perform, and that loves you without a scale of standard. And that's a tangible, that's a hard thing to kind of grasp, but that's kind of my encouragement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you both so much for the work that you're doing, for this message. What I heard you saying just then, Isaac, was the gospel message that I was taught as an evangelical growing up of God's unconditional love that didn't actually play out in reality because the other teachings were performance-based. But
Exactly.
what you're talking about is the real message of unconditional love,
Mm-hmm.
of God. And wow, that's, yeah, we all need that. We all need to hear that. So thank you both. And thanks to everyone for watching on YouTube. Your comments, your questions. I will share this. There was another resource shared on YouTube, Marlene Winnell, a series of articles on religious trauma syndrome, which is another resource out there for folks interested in looking into this further, having resources to share with therapists, etc. So I hope folks will check out Teresa's book, the foreword, and I believe there's a sample available on chalicepress.com from the book. so you can download that and start reading. The Kindle version is available if you're an Amazon Kindle reader. It's available this month only for $4.99. So grab that while it's on sale, and get it on your Kindle tonight and start reading. And look for Teresa. She's going to be on the road in different parts of the country over the next few months. So I hope that you will seek her out. Go to transformnetwork.org if you want to bring her in as a speaker. And thank you again. Thank you both. Thank you everyone for watching. And we'll be doing this again. So like Chalice Press on Facebook and keep up with all of our online events. So thank you both.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Mhm.